Welcome back to the War Room, where we've gone up to 1917 and we're really getting into the birth of modern warfare. In the last video we took a look at a British battalion attack on the Somme in September 1916, and one of the key takeaways was the idea that extended weapon ranges, particularly the ranges of machine guns and artillery, had made the battlefield a lot deeper. Fighting was no longer restricted to the troops in contact. Now positions hundreds and thousands of meters on either side of the lines could be involved. This presents a number of offensive and defensive tactical hurdles, and what we're going to do in this video is take a step up from the micro level and have a more macro overview of how both sides try to tackle them in 1917. This also means that we're back to talking about general trends, broad changes and theory rather than granular detail. On the defensive, the Germans essentially double down on depth. Instead of fighting from a series of lines, the German defence is now envisaged as a series of zones. The first zone is the area in contact with the French or British. It's where the attackers can conduct the most effective reconnaissance. They can observe German positions and push reconnaissance patrols into and across no man's land to gather more detailed information. So this forward zone is very vulnerable. We saw this in the last two videos at Neuve-Chapelle and on the Somme. In both those cases, the British were able to identify the German positions, mass significant amounts of artillery, accurately register that artillery on those positions, and then smash them at 0 hour. Manning the front line with large numbers of troops and trying to hold on to ground at all costs just means that large numbers of troops get obliterated by the barrage. So the new defensive concept no longer conceptualizes the line of contact with the enemy as a line to be defended to the last man. Instead, there's now an outpost zone. This is basically lightly defended buffer space, potentially a kilometre deep. It's not there to stop significant attacks or even large raids. It's there so that the attackers' ground-based observers and reconnaissance patrols can't gather information on the other defensive zones further back. Because of the revolution in infantry firepower, the individual outposts don't need to be strongly manned to do this, especially when supplemented by copious amounts of barbed wire. We've seen over and over how much trouble a couple of men with a machine gun can cause, so the outposts are held by platoon or even squad-sized elements. These are still probably going to get hammered when the attacker's barrage comes in, but because they're small, spread out elements, they're harder targets to hit, and the overall defense isn't going to be compromised if they're lost. Coming under a major attack, these outposts are tasked with sounding the alarm by telephone if the wires survive the artillery, by signal flares or rockets if the weather is suitable, and inevitably by runner. This alerts the other zones and kicks off other defensive arrangements, for example blocking barrages from the defending artillery. Behind the outpost zone is the main line of resistance. This is a more conventional linear trench system, though still lightly held, and it serves as a barrier to enemy attacks. As previous experience has shown, it's not going to stop a significant offensive effort, but it does force the attacker to fight a full-on set-piece battle to punch through. Behind the MLR is the battle zone. Again, the new system moves away from continuous lines and instead relies on a large number of individual but mutually supporting strongpoints to a depth of plus 2 kilometers. The concept is that the enemy attack will culminate in the battle zone as attacking units trying to exploit past the main line of resistance become delayed, disrupted and fragmented. Instead of a cohesive push into the defender's depth, the attacker will instead be broken up as his constituent elements are snagged on obstacles and defensive positions or held up by machine gun or artillery fire. At this point, the Germans counterattack. At least half of any defending unit should be held in reserve for this purpose. The concept of the whole defensive system is to bring the attacker in, break him up and bog him down, disrupt his command and control, and then destroy him with counterattacks. Behind the battle zone is the rearward zone. This is where the defending artillery is set up and where the larger counterattacking elements are held in reserve. This is far enough back that it's out of range of all but the heaviest enemy artillery, but close enough to dominate the outpost and battle zones. It's protected from any attacking troops who make it through the battle zone by another trench system, the artillery protection line. So we have a very deep defensive system which isn't so much designed to stop and hold out against an attacker as it is to degrade his combat power with firepower and then destroy him with counterattacks. It's a kind of defense in depth, but also a kind of elastic defense in the sense that the force of an enemy attack is absorbed and then the defenders can spring back via counterattacks. One of the key components of this new system is mitigating the effects of the attacker's artillery. This is primarily accomplished by depth, but the Germans also make changes at lower tactical levels. Deep shelters were very effective at protecting troops from artillery on the Somme, but these were really a byproduct of the local geography and couldn't be dug elsewhere because the ground conditions weren't suitable. Their protection also came at a cost to tactical responsiveness. Because they were so deep, it could take a long time for the defenders sheltering inside to deploy, and if the attackers were closely following their barrage, they could win the race to the parapet and already be in the trenches or throwing hand grenades down into the shelters as the defenders were trying to get out. So the Germans start to build with concrete. Concrete is a very effective resistant material. It can provide good protection closer to the surface, allowing the defenders to deploy quickly. These shelters are connected with each other by communications trenches in order to provide some protected routes across the battlefield, but in general the actual fighting takes place in the inevitable crate escape rather than the trenches. Trenches are easy to identify via aerial reconnaissance, so they become targets for enemy artillery and known points that the enemy's infantry can reference as they attack. Craters, on the other hand, are everywhere and can be quickly improvised into defensive positions that are just as strong as formal trench lines. So when we're talking about outposts and strong points in the new defensive system, we're not necessarily talking about heavily engineered, textbook-looking field fortifications. Instead, we're looking at a few concrete shelters connected by communication trenches and surrounded by wire obstacles. This is not only to make the positions harder to identify from the air, but it decreases the amount of work the troops need to do. Trench maintenance is very labour intensive, and because individual positions are generally smaller, they have fewer troops available to carry that maintenance out. The siting of these positions has also undergone a rethink. Broadly speaking, there was a pre-war emphasis on exploiting the new and impressive maximum ranges of new infantry small arms and machine guns. This generally involved setting up on forward slopes and high ground. After all, the further you can see, the greater the range you can start to engage at. Wartime experience has by now confirmed that the reverse is also true. Positions sited to maximise their own firepower are also exposed to the maximum firepower of the enemy, with, given the Allied ability to concentrate vast amounts of artillery, fatal consequences. So there is a shift towards reverse slope positions at the expense of long engagement ranges. This way positions are shielded from enemy ground observation while being just as, or even more, effective. Long range fire is naturally less accurate than close range fire, and target troops have plenty of time to adapt to it, either mitigating its effects by dispersing and advancing by short rushes, or simply being able to psychologically accommodate a steady dribble of low casualties at long intervals. Fire from close range is much more accurate and likely to be significantly more effective. Not only is it likely to obviously cause more casualties simply because it's easier to hit targets at closer range, but it's also able to cause more casualties in a shorter space of time and inflict a psychological shock that is much harder to deal with. Ideally, the concept is to conduct a closer range fire ambush on the attackers, forcing them to go to ground and become pinned in place, ready for defensive artillery or counterattacks to finish them off. In other words, between all of these measures, we can see the Germans are trying to adapt to the firepower-dominated battlefield. Not only is the defense now oriented to mitigate the effects of enemy direct and indirect fire through depth, dispersion, camouflage and hardening, but it's also oriented to conduct the defense with firepower. In the outpost and main battle zones, there are frequently no troops or positions between outposts and strongpoints. Instead, the gaps are swept by machine gun fire and pre-registered for artillery. So this new system is simultaneously defending against and defending with firepower. A lot of the reasoning behind this is due to the destructive effects of British and French artillery. And this is now also starting to emphasize depth. The signature component of this is the so-called creeping barrage. This is not new in 1917, but what we saw at Neuve-Chapelle and 4 DWR's action on the Somme were lifting barrages. The artillery fired on the German front line for a set amount of time, then it lifted and fell on a second target further back for another set amount of time. This is effective, but defending positions in depth or defending positions that have not been identified, whether because they were well hidden in advance or have been improvised after the bombardment, remain, and they inflict casualties and degrade the cohesion of the attacking infantry. The solution to this is the creeping barrage. Here, the artillery puts down a wall of shells, and instead of lifting it from target to target, it lifts by a set distance at set intervals to correspond with the anticipated speed of the infantry. So, for example, the barrage might advance 100 meters every 3 minutes. In effect, this provides a protective curtain in front of attacking troops that forces the defender to keep their heads down. Infantry are encouraged to stay as close as possible to the barrage, even to the point of accepting friendly casualties, in order to fully exploit its suppressive effect. The ideal circumstance is that attacking troops are on top of the defensive positions the instant the barrage lifts, and they can destroy or capture the defenders as or before they leave their shelters. That's the broad concept of the creeping barrage, to deal with actual and potential enemy positions in depth. The barrage can consist of several lines of artillery fire at different distances ahead of the infantry, and it can get very complex. There is a constant balancing act between the proportion of different shell types in different parts of the barrage, ranging from shrapnel shells to high explosive to increasingly available new smoke shells. Different elements of the barrage can consist of different types of artillery, ranging from light to heavy pieces and even involving machine gun batteries used in the indirect role. And to cap it all off, all of these different elements need not operate in sync. The accumulation of experience and technical improvements by 1917 has made artillery an incredibly flexible instrument. Individual lines of artillery in the barrage can advance, retreat, wheel and pause independently of one another in order to achieve specific tactical effects. For example, a barrage line may hit a defensive position, move on or pause to give the defenders time to deploy in expectation of an infantry attack following it, only to find the barrage resumes or walks back on top of them. So we have the creeping barrage, which is there to suppress the enemy for a significant distance in front of the infantry. This is in addition to concentrations on identified strongpoints, counter battery fire, and the engagement of all kinds of other target sets in depth. A couple of new critical enablers for artillery that come in 1917 are the increasing ability to conduct predicted fire and the development and rollout of the British No. 106 fuse. Predicted fire is exactly what it says on the tin. By 1917, the artillery arm has developed to the point where registration of fire is not necessarily needed. Batteries can now input data from a huge array of sources, from target location to weather effects to barrel wear to ammunition batch characteristics, and get the results they need to hit targets on the first try. Previously, registration fire would frequently give the game away and provide defenders with advance warning that something was about to happen. Now bombardments can come in without warning, and attacks have a better chance of achieving tactical surprise. This is more immediately useful in small-scale actions, because major offences require the stockpiling and accumulation of guns and ammunition in such vast quantities it's very difficult to conceal, but it does make the artillery considerably more responsive when it's needed to be and when the communications are working. The 106 fuse is a technical development that massively increases the effectiveness of high explosive shells. Essentially, the 106 is a reliable, instantaneous contact fuse, so shells tipped with it will explode upon hitting the ground, rather than burying themselves in the dirt where their explosive effect is minimized. This makes HE shells now capable of effectively cutting wire, which they weren't very good at before, and of inflicting more damage to targets in the open, like artillery pieces, as well as being an effective fuse for smoke shells, which obviously also work better when they explode at ground level and not underneath it. Gas is also becoming an important component of fire plans for both sides. Various technical developments have made gas shells more reliable, and in the specific case of the British, the Livens projector has emerged as an effective means of delivering a large volume of gas onto a target in a short space of time. Protection against gas is constantly keeping pace with chemical weapon development, so gas attacks are not necessarily liable to cause significant casualties, but they retain important effects beyond their killing potential. Gas masks are uncomfortable and fatiguing to wear, making simple tasks and physical exertion much more difficult for the troops who have to wear them. So swamping enemy communication trenches and forming up points with gas adds layers of friction to his attempts to move around in his own depth. In particular, gas is very effective as a counter-battery weapon. Working an artillery piece is hard manual labour, and crews forced to do that work in protective gear are going to do it slower and for a shorter amount of time. Moving guns or bringing up ammunition is primarily carried out with the aid of horses. A battery which has its horses gassed is essentially fixed in place, and its supply of ammunition at least temporarily broken, reducing its effectiveness and pinning it in place, exposed to further counter-battery fire. So we have some significant developments in the use of and technical ability of the artillery. What about the infantry? Because you can have all the artillery in the world, and by this point in the war France and Britain really do have most of it, but there are always defenders left after the artillery is done, and it's always the infantry who need to go forward and dig them out of their trenches. There is in fact a conscious recognition that the kind of concentrated artillery fire used so far in the war is not as much destructive as it is suppressive. The concept of the creeping barrage, the targeting of positions in depth and counter-battery fire, is not to destroy the enemy. This is very difficult, although any results are obviously beneficial. Instead, the concept is to force the enemy to keep their heads down or stop serving their guns so that friendly infantry can advance and deal with isolated surviving enemy positions. And the infantry has been reorganized and equipped to do this more effectively. By the start of 1917, building on the lessons of the Somme, the British have designated the platoon as the main infantry unit. Each platoon is now split into 4 sections built around different weapon systems. There is a rifle section, a bomber section with a high proportion of hand grenades, a Lewis gun section consisting of a light machine gun and ammo bearers, and a rifle grenade section. This naturally breaks the platoon into a fire support element consisting of the Lewis gun and the rifle grenades, and a maneuver element consisting of riflemen and bombers. When the platoon encounters an enemy position as it follows the barrage, the Lewis gun and rifle grenades can suppress it, while the riflemen and bombers work their way onto a flank to close with it and destroy it with grenades, rifle fire and the bayonet. So the platoon now has the organic firepower to deal with something like a machine gun nest in a way that it previously didn't. Another significant change here is that the 4 sections aren't necessarily tightly tied to the platoon. In order to be able to carry out fire and maneuver, the individual sections necessarily need to be able to operate with a degree of freedom and independence. So we can see that as the platoon spreads out, responsibility is being pushed down to lower levels. The platoon commander remains in charge, but the section commanders are increasingly becoming sub-commanders in their own right. This does not necessarily relate to depth, except arguably in the fact that the organic firepower of the infantry platoon gives them the ability to mop up defending positions faster and therefore maintain momentum in the attack. But in essence, what we're seeing is the fire and maneuver concept at the macro and micro levels. Artillery suppresses the enemy and allows the infantry to close with and destroy him in exactly the same way that the infantry platoon itself subdivides into a suppressive fire element that enables a maneuver assault element. Another new development is the tank. The concept is great. As protected mobile firepower, the tank can advance across no man's land without succumbing to German machine gun or rifle fire, while bringing light artillery or its own machine guns along to support the infantry. The reality is that tanks seriously strain the technological limits of the time. Especially to start with, they are mechanically unreliable, suffering frequent breakdowns even before they have to contend with the difficult terrain of First World War battlefields. the defending Germans also quickly adapt, supplying armour-piercing bullets as a prelude to the first anti-tank rifles and incorporating field guns, anti-tank mines and anti-tank ditches into their defensive arrangements. This isn't to say that tanks weren't a significant development, but the technology just isn't there yet for them to realise their potential. Warfare remains hinged on artillery infantry coordination, with tanks as a useful adjunct, but not a necessary one, at least for now. So, we have a collection of tactical changes and improvements on both sides. The Germans have gone in a more revolutionary direction compared to the more evolutionary British, but both sides are essentially building on and refining what they've been doing throughout the war, incorporating new ideas, technical and material developments. Rather obviously, none of these end the war in 1917. Most of them have some significant problems in theory and practice. They all take time to really get going, and the way the offensive and defensive developments interact with one another is an important step on the road to modern warfare. We'll take a look at some 1917 fighting in the next War Room video. Hope you all enjoyed this and found it interesting. I'll catch you in the next one.